Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 8, and this is Session 13. We left off at the very end. In fact, the last paragraph in the notes that by the way, we don't have new notes today because last week we did notes that were part of an addendum. They came in the middle of the notes I'd handed out before that. We're still in those notes. We were about to go to a passage and look in Isaiah. Before we go over to Isaiah, I wanted to make sure that you understood some things about the prophets. This is going to help us to think about all this the right way. So there are some things about the prophets, and I'm going to put them up here on the PowerPoint for us to go over. And this may be on our kids' Bible Safari. So if it is, this is what you'll be filling in, these parts that are in yellow and underlined. Background on the prophets in general. Isaiah to Malachi, which is all those prophets that have books written that are written by them, are fifth course of punishment prophets. Number two, contained in the prophets are 7 major doctrinal issues. I'm not listing them for you today. I've given them to you before. There may come a time in a study in the future where we may go back through those and review those, but I didn't think it was important to do that for today. But sitting in the prophets, there are 7 major topics that the prophets are all discussing. Number 3, the prophets are commonly divided into 2 groups, the major and the minor prophets. That's okay, and if you're going to make that division, then do it this way. The major prophets contain information concerning all 7 doctrinal issues. But you understand that as they're doing that, as a matter of fact, look, let me just do it like this. When you start out with Isaiah, he is going to talk about all 7 major doctrinal issues. But you know what he's going to do? He's going to do this in a very general way, a very basic understanding. He's just going to kind of lay a foundation for that. The major prophets that come after him are each going to build on the information and expand it a little bit. But all the major prophets are going to talk about all 7 major doctrinal issues. And then lastly, each of the minor prophets address only a few of those major doctrinal issues. And as they do, they are really putting the meat on the bones, filling in the details, giving us a lot of the finer points of what's going on with all of that. But there is another kind of breakdown in those Old Testament prophets that we need to be aware of. And that is Isaiah to Zephaniah. Not Zechariah, Zephaniah. That'd be the first, if you're going to divide it this other way, and I'll show you why. And the second one is Haggai to Malachi. Yes, ma'am.
If anybody wants to know, we're on the notes dated November 12th through April 15th, and we're on the bottom of page 19.
Oh, good. Page 19 in those notes. Okay. So if you still, are there any copies of those still back on the table if anybody doesn't have them?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Anyway, there might be if you want to grab those in case you didn't bring yours back. Okay. And if we're making the division this other way, here's the first one, here's the second one. There's only 3 prophets in this one. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Does anybody know why you'd make the distinguishment between Isaiah to Zephaniah being one group, Haggai to Malachi being the second group? Here's why. Because this group right here, they write their books after Israel had returned from the 70 years captivity in Babylon. Everybody else is writing either before the 5th course of punishment or during the 5th course of punishment. These 3 write after that first installment of the 5th course of punishment is over. The 70 years are up. Israel has come back into the land. Okay, So just so you get that, and look, I thought it was important for us to just take a minute and kind of see that breakdown of the prophets just that way. And just as there is an order and a progression to Paul's epistles, there's an order and progression to those Old Testament prophets as well. Just like Paul starts off very basic and goes to the more complex, they do the same thing. We often call it milk to meat. You give babies milk and adults have meat, and you have to, your digestion has to be able to handle those things. Well, it's the same kind of pattern that we're seeing there in those books. There's one other thing, and that is to say that there's a pattern within each book. And this is important for us to realize, because when you're studying, look, we can no longer be the way we were when we were just going to church in the old days, where a preacher's preaching a sermon, and he opens up his book to, Isaiah, and he starts reading something out of Isaiah over there, and we just kind of look at that like, man, that Old Testament is big and complicated, and I give you these kinds of things so you can get your bearings in this, so you can know some things about it. So now let me talk to you about a pattern that is in every single one of the prophets, so that you'll understand something when you start reading there. Look, here, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we're going to pick Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah. It doesn't matter. When those prophets start out writing, what they start with is a description of that first installment of the fifth course of punishment. If you look up here, you'll see that 5:1, Israel's captivity, times of the Gentiles. When I say Israel, I'm talking about both houses. The Syrians took the northern kingdom away, Babylonians took the southern kingdom away. That's that 70 years captivity. When these prophets open up, they start talking to the nation, especially if they're not in that 70-year captivity. They start talking to the nation about, you guys are on the threshold of crossing over a line that once this fifth course of punishment gets itself underway, there's no going back. You will cross a line that you cannot get back over. Once you start this process, even though they may not, until Daniel writes, they may not have a full knowledge and appreciation that there is more than one installment to the fifth course of punishment. But when Daniel writes about that, look, he's in that 70-year captivity, and he's telling them, that's not all. But God is telling them, all the things that are going to happen in this fifth course of punishment are going to happen if you go into this. You need to stop and think about what you're doing. So, at the beginning of every one of these prophets, they're talking about the time in which they're living right then. That's at the front of the book. As you progress through the book, the prophets will begin... Where's that laser pointer I had? As you progress through the book, they're going to start talking about the other installments of the fifth course of punishment. They're going to be talking about the second installment, or they'll be talking about the third installment, which is that 400 years of silence, or they'll be talking about the fourth installment, which is the days of the Messiah, where John the Baptist is going to show up. And they'll talk about, and then they'll also be talking about that fifth and final. I have the pointer, but it's in that black right there. It's in the Lord's in the tribulation period there. They'll talk, and at the end of the book, they'll be talking about the last. Do you see that progression? So if we're living during the time of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is warning and saying, you guys, you're about to do something you can't undo. Look, turn around from this thing. You don't want to go into Look, if God spews you out of this land, you're going to be in the hands of your enemies. He's going to talk about, and God is going to walk away from you. You're no longer going to be His people. He's no longer going to be your God. Don't do this. But then as he continues to write, he's going to not only just talk about that first installment of the fifth course of punishment, and he's going to start outlining other things to come, and then he's going to wind up with the end of it out there to talk about how terrible and dreadful that final installment is going to be. Well, I want to give you an example of that. So up here, we're going to start with Isaiah 1:1. So take a look. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So we now know he's prophesying to the southern kingdom. We know that from that verse because he's talking about the kings of Judah. And where is that on the timetable? Now, the kids with their Bibles so far, you'll be able to fill in some things on that. If you flip it over in the back, you've got that timeline there. And I'm going to fill some things in for you here. So Israel goes captive. I don't know what's missing on your Bible Safari, so I'm just going to fill it all in. Israel goes captive in 722 BC. Judah goes captive in 586 BC. So you can see that there's about 150 years difference between the time the Assyrians carry away Israel and the time the Babylonians carry away Judah. And then you've got Hosea. Hosea starts in 753 BC. He starts his prophetic ministry, and he ends that in 715 BC. And I put it on that timeline so you could see, look, here's Hosea starts his ministry before Micah starts his. And Micah starts his before Isaiah starts his. I'm just trying to show you how all of that kind of moves in relation to each other. Because when you're just looking at the books in the Old Testament, Isaiah is the first one, but Micah's sitting over there further along, and you get to thinking, oh, well, he doesn't happen until later. Actually, he starts his ministry before Isaiah does. Why put Isaiah first? Because the things that are written in Isaiah's prophecy are the fundamental, basic issues that Israel needed to be introduced to. And when that got laid out in the Scripture, Isaiah is to the Old Testament prophets what Romans is to Paul's epistles. Isaiah is to the Old Testament prophets what Genesis is to the Old Testament. What is Genesis doing? It's taking you back into the beginning, and it's laying things out that you can't find anywhere else, and then knowledge gets built on that. When you get to the prophets, Isaiah is the one that leads the way. It's the first book you'll come to because that's the book that's laying out those general basic principles on those 7 major doctrinal issues that every Israelite needed to be familiar with. And so, but in the time of it, look, there are always guys. When I went to Bible college, there was a professor who used to say, it's a shame the books of the Bible didn't get published in their chronological order that they were written. If you'd done that, you would have destroyed all the pattern of the education that's supposed to be there in the Bible. But because they didn't know there was one, they didn't see the problem with that. Okay, so Micah, just to fill that in, is 743 to 687. And then Isaiah starts in 740 BC and goes to 681 BC. And then when you get down, I've already filled this one in on the bottom, just to give you an idea, because look, we started with Hosea in 753. But look, That's the end of Jonah's ministry. This is not on that timeline. I just kind of set it down here to look at. See, when Hosea starts his ministry, that's the end of Jonah's ministry. When Elisha finishes his ministry, that's when Jonah picks up. Elijah comes before Elisha, who is followed by Jonah, who is followed by Hosea, who is followed by Micah, who is followed by Isaiah, and they become contemporaries of each other. Do you see how that's laying out? Just kind of give everybody an idea for how that's going. And what you can do is, you can plug in the kings of Judah along this timeline and see who prophesied during the reign of whoever. So when you get to Isaiah 1:1, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of... So we know that during this time, you have Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and the start of Hezekiah's rule. So he's prophesying during the time of 4 kings in Judah. Now I said all that just to kind of give you a historical context for when this is happening. Now let's look in verse 2. Because here, so as soon as he's introduced himself and when he's doing it, what is verse 2 going to do? It's going to give you the initial warning that the 5th course of punishment is on its way. So look in verse 2. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. And now God is going to indict them for their wickedness. So look in verse 3. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib, but Israel doth not know, my people doth not consider. And so God is now going to say, and you know what? Because of what you guys have done, you have provoked me to anger. So verse 4. Sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, a seed of evildoers, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked the Holy One of Israel unto anger. They are gone away backward. When he says you provoke the Holy One of Israel unto anger, look, they already know where they are. Again, I don't know what I did with that laser pointer. I guess I ate it. I'll dig it out at the break. But you're up there at number 4. You're at the 4th course of punishment. And you're about to bloop over into the 5th course of punishment. And so the warning now is come. Look, you know what a preacher will do? He'll read those opening verses in Isaiah. He'll act like it's talking to people that are sitting in the church pews that day. And he'll talk about, oh, you sinful people, laden with iniquity. You know, you provoke God unto anger. And then he'll say, and that's why we had a hurricane down on the Gulf. And that's why we had tornadoes up there in Oklahoma. You provoked the Holy One to anger. And everybody's like, just rip the passage completely out of its context. That, you know what, when you say those things, you don't even understand you're living in a time of grace. You think it's about performance. You think you're under the law. No wonder nobody can get anything. All right, but my point is, you understand the context, right? Israel has been going through the progressive courses of punishment. They were told about those back in Leviticus 26. And now they're in the 4th one, and now Isaiah is standing up and saying, hey, Judah, pay attention. You're about now to go into the 5th, and if you go into that one, there is no turning around. That's it. You're going to get it all. So just go back over there to Leviticus 26. Go back over there to Deuteronomy. Read about that. Do you want that? You really want to provoke the Holy One of Israel unto anger? Do you want to do that? So that's the warning that's being given to them here. And so, verse 5. Why should you be stricken anymore? What in the world is he talking about? He's talking about in this 4th course of punishment. You've been in this 4th course of punishment now for a while, and God has used the rod to try to turn you around, and you know what? It hasn't slowed you guys up at all. So the question he asks now is, Why should you be stricken anymore? In other words, why should God continue in this fourth course of punishment? Look what follows. You will revolt more and more. The whole head is sick and the whole heart faint. This fourth course of punishment, the punishment was meant to turn you around. It hasn't done that. So why should God continue to do this in this fourth course of punishment? Why should He continue to strike you this way? Because it evidently isn't doing any good. He'll continue in verse 6 to talk about their condition. From the sole of the foot even unto the head there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. They have not been closed, neither bound up, neither mollified with ointment. Is he really talking about everybody in Israel is covered with sores and all of that? You know, he's talking about their spiritual condition. That's what he's talking about. He's saying, you know what? You guys are sick from the top of your head to the sole of your foot, and all of these things that God has been doing to try to get you to turn around, it hasn't done a thing. You guys are continuing right along. Verse 7. Your country is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your land, strangers devour it in your presence. And it's desolate, as overthrown by strangers. And the daughter of Zion is left as a cottage in a vineyard, as a lodge in a garden of cucumbers, as a besieged city. I can't help but smile because I have to tell you, in the old days when I read that verse, I thought, the daughter of Zion is like a lodge in a garden of cucumbers. And I looked at that and I thought, what in the world is that? Well, today I'm going to tell you what that is. But the one I chose to do that is the cottage in the vineyard. It's the same thing with the lodge in the garden of cucumbers. In order to understand those two phrases, you have to understand how agriculture worked back in that day. When they got ready to harvest the crops, there was always a cottage or a lodge, some kind of a house or building that was built right in the middle of the fields. And when the people came in to harvest the crops, they all lived in that house. They were right there in the middle of the work. But what happened as soon as all the harvest was brought in? They went back home. And what happened to that house they were staying in? Anybody? No. Yeah, it was left empty. I mean, it would be there for the next harvest the next year, but if you went looking at that after the harvest, you'd look at that and you'd go, there's nothing here. They wouldn't leave food there. It'd be another year before they'd be back, right? So, you know what? It would be just stripped bare. There was nothing in there. Look how he starts this out. Your country is... Look. In the nation, in Judah, we did this thing, you know how the Jordan comes down, you kind of have that Sea of Galilee, it comes down, you have that Dead Sea that does like this, and Jerusalem sits right here, and that dividing line is about right there between Israel and Judah. Isaiah is prophesying to Judah because Israel has already gone away captive. That's done. Now he's prophesying to Judah, and he's saying, before I talk about that, let's do it this way. When the enemy comes in to Judah, and let's just make this the Mediterranean as it goes like that, all right? This is the, I don't know if it's on the camera or not, but here's the Mediterranean Sea. When the enemies would come in against Judah, they didn't overcome the whole area in a day or a week. You know what they did? They started at the borders and they began to take... Now remember, Jerusalem, here's Jerusalem, that's a stronghold. So what they're doing is they're coming into other areas and they're beginning to eat away at the land little by little, taking control. Do you remember back when ISIS was, in the news all the time because they were just spreading, remember? They were in Syria, and then they were just spreading across the Middle East over there. They went into Iraq, and they were taking control of big cities and all of that. But see, they didn't do that in a day. It was just little by little, little by little. And that's what he's describing here. Your country is desolate. In other words, out there among the cities, out there in the countryside, nobody's left out there. Do you know why? Too dangerous. The enemies are coming into the land. In the fourth course of punishment, they're already coming in. Your cities are burned with fire. Not every city, but the smaller ones. The enemies were coming in and burning them with fire and taking over. He says, your land, strangers devour it in your presence. That was already happening in the fourth course of punishment. Judah was already shrinking. They had not gone away into captivity yet, but they were on their way. It was the natural progression of things. He says, and the daughter of Zion is left like an empty harvest cottage when the harvest is over. You know what your land is going to be like? Because everybody knew what that was. Just remember what that lodge was like when you were going out there when you first arrived from the harvest and you saw how desolate and empty that thing was, and when you left, how empty and desolate it was. That's the way your land is going to be. It's going to be emptied out. And it's going to be stripped barren. And there's going to be anything left. Why is God saying that to them through Isaiah? Because He's hoping that will make them wake up and turn back to the Lord. That's what He's really hoping for. Okay, I'm going to stop right here because I have 12 seconds left. We're going to just reboot this and then we'll go right into the next session.